everybody, welcome to another edition of Juneau-Douglas City Museum's Behind the Scenes video tour. Today we are in another one of our collection storage areas. This is where we keep the majority of what we would call archival material, as well as a lot of our framed pieces. And archival material generally references something that's two-dimensional, usually of paper origin. So wanted to show you guys a little bit today. We've already looked at an object in our collection that's made of metal. We've already seen some paintings, which would be considered an art piece, and then today we're going to talk a little bit about something that we would consider to be part of our archival collection. So talk a little bit about that. Like in our other section, we talked a little bit about how to prepare yourself to handle collections materials. So for those who watched the previous video, you'll notice my hair is already pulled back, my scarf's removed, all jewelry is off, and my sleeves are rolled up, so I'm ready to go. Now, how we store collections materials varies depending on the space you have and the materials of the object that you're putting into storage. So for something like this piece here, which notice I'm not telling you what it is just yet, keep you guessing for a little bit longer, it is made of paper. So normally we'd store them in something like this, which would be an acid-free plastic bag that is custom made to be the appropriate size for that piece. Each object is going to be labeled with its own unique number. Here at the Juneau-Douglas City Museum, we use what is referred to as the Trinomial System. That means it's 3 numbers that help reference different aspects of that object's history. So the first one's going to be the year it came to us. The second number is going to be the number of the accession it is, which means how many came before it. So if it's the 5th package that we accepted as a donation, it's going to be at the 5th number. And then the last number is going to be the number of the specific object in the overall accession. So that helps us identify this specific object when we're looking for it, both in a digital database, online, or here in the collection storage area. Once it's safely encased in this, we then put them in special archival storage boxes. These are smaller boxes that allow for us to store things upright, which can be less harmful on them. It means things aren't going to be stacked on top of each other. And these are all acid-free, which means over time they won't disintegrate and cause problems with the object itself, either yellowing or disintegration itself. Sometimes old boxes or other materials were used to store objects and they've reacted poorly with the objects themselves, which not only destroyed the box but also destroyed the object. A really good example of that is if you look in really old scrapbooks, maybe that your grandparents made, and they taped photos in there. That tape will eventually become very brittle and will actually yellow the photographs. So while it seems like a good idea at the time, for us museum professionals, when we're thinking about storing something for decades, possibly centuries, we want to make sure that that object doesn't have anything touching it that could cause further deterioration and further damage. So as a result, we have these extra precautions. So that being said, we're going to move on to the highlight of this particular video, which is going to be this album here. So this is a very unique object. I haven't seen another one like this, and it's actually one of my favorite collection stories to tell. A gentleman called up the museum asking if we would be interested in a photo album that his dad had when he was stationed here in Juneau during World War II. Now I envisioned, he said that his father was here in the 40s and 50s and had this album. Now I envisioned just random snapshots, quite often of family members or places around town, and I thought, well, at the very least, that's very useful for us here at the museum because it will allow us to show the passage and development of Juneau over time. However, when he sent me the album, come to find out, it's actually made by 2 very famous photographers here in Juneau and around Alaska and around the United States, to be honest, and is actually from much earlier. It's from the early 1900s, and it was made and deals with just Juneau. So we asked everybody who was watching if you guys knew who these photographers were. Most people in Juneau have probably heard their names, maybe elsewhere, it's not as popular. They're known as Winter and Pond. So this dynamic duo were not original Alaskans themselves, and they began a business here in Juneau in 1893. So we'll remind those who aren't from Juneau or maybe don't know too much about Juneau history, Juneau really started as a town in 1880, which means that Winter and Pond were here pretty early. And really, Lloyd Valentine Winter was the first one to come. He came from San Francisco in 1890, and he began a photo business with George Landerkin. And the two of them set up shop and worked together for 3 years until 1893, when Winter's longtime friend, Edwin Percy Pond, came up to join him. Now, Pond bought out Landerkin's stake in the business, and then Winter and Pond formed their own company, their own studio, and would go on to work together for the next 50 years. They had a studio here in Juneau, but they also traveled around the state and documented the Yukon Gold Rush, various Native Alaskan groups and traditions, and also photographed a lot of downtown Juneau as it grew over the 50 years they were here. They actually continued working until Pond passed away in 1943, and then Winter sold the business to a gentleman by the name of Francis Harrison, who continued to run Winter and Pond Co. until 1956. So there are people in town who probably remember Winter and Pond being open and functioning here in Juneau, which is a lot of fun. This album depicts Juneau in the really early days and is very, very unique in that it's something that was sold for the tourist trade in Juneau. In addition to their studio in town, in addition to traveling around and taking photographs, they also ran a curio shop, which is a very blanket term that is often used in Alaska during the frontier days to really include a large amount of sales, mainly that of Native Alaskan artists. At a time when it's difficult to determine where those materials came from, curio shops can often be vilified as places where stolen goods were sold or where anthropologists would collect things, not always on the best terms. So always something to remember when you see the name curio store. It can be good and bad. Some shops did work with Native Alaskans to sell their work, some did not. It really depends on the store itself. Something that Winter and Pond did was they also sold scrapbooks of their photographs, and they also had a thriving postcard business in which they turned their photographs into postcards that were then sold all over the country. So we're going to take a little bit of a closer look at this album, and just bear with us for 1 second. So here we have our wonderful album. What's unique about this is that it was obviously given as a gift, and we can't have difficulty reading that bottom portion, but it does look like it's to Mrs. S. Corbus. So not quite sure who that was, but somebody bought this for somebody else, which is kind of fun. And you'll see this is a Winter and Pond photograph on the cover, and then with Juneau, Alaska, and it's tied with string that's still remarkably intact. And this album is copyrighted in 1909, although a fair amount of the photographs are from a couple of years before that, but none later than 1909. So these are really the early days of Juneau within the first couple of decades, which is pretty fun. What I really do love about this album is that they have panoramics inside. So the first photograph is actually going to be a panoramic of Juneau from the Courthouse Hill, which we now refer to as Telephone Hill, where the state office building now sits, the main portion of it. So this would be looking at Main Street. Up here is Chicken Ridge, Star Hill, and then more of the downtown area down to the waterfront. For those of you in Juneau, you'll notice the waterfront looks very different. In the later years of Juneau, these areas started to get filled in from mine tailings, and then eventually, intentionally, we filled in some of that beach area to create more downtown space. So when you look at early photographs of the Juneau waterline and the waterfront in general, it's going to be very difficult to match up with modern day photographs, as I have learned in trying to figure out where some of these photographs were taken from. So one other thing to remember when you're working with something that's archival is these books were not meant to be folded flat. They're a little bit more difficult, and it being this old, we want to make sure that we preserve this area here on the binding. So you'll notice I'm not pulling it all the way open. There is some space for folding, but overall, it's a little bit more delicate. We want to make sure that we preserve this for other people to look at. So I'll try not to go through every single photograph, but we'll go a little bit quickly through, and you can see the types of photographs. These are actually printed on paper. It's not anything glossy like we would know today. and it looks like they're glued directly just onto the paper itself. So a few are separating a little bit, which basically means that the glue itself is deteriorating, as is to be expected when something's about 100 years old. But given that it's that old, it's actually in very good condition, and all of the prints for the most part are still securely in place. So as we move through here, they're all on thick sheets of paper, and you'll see the log church, which was turned into a brewery and then was eventually torn down, and they rebuilt a replica in the 80s on the same block but on the different corner, which stood until the early 2000s. So this is one of the first churches here in Juneau and is very unique because it is a log cabin. And that replica log cabin actually was one of the first places that the City Museum had any kind of display space, so it holds a little special place in our heart here. And moving on, we do have some very large aerial photographs. Juneau is unique and special in that we have these very steep mountains right next to town, so it's easier to get some of these aerial photographs because you can actually, well, easy might be the wrong word, but you can climb up the side of the mountain and get a pretty good aerial shot. So you'll be able to see the town as it was growing. This is Evergreen Bowl, where now which we now have Cope Park, and you can see there actually used to be a lot of water in there. There was a pond there for quite some time before it was fully filled in to create that park. This is one of the mills and mine sites in Perseverance Gold Mine, which was in Silverbow Basin, so that's in the mountains behind downtown Juneau. This is one of the early methods of placer mining, which used heavy hoses and large jets of water to wash away the gravel and the dirt, which would then be put through sluices and mined for gold. The gold would separate from the dirt. This is actually Front Street, which still exists today, and there are quite a few buildings that actually date from this time period. So if you do walk down Front Street in Juneau, you'll still be able to see some of these buildings and match them up to these very old photographs, which is pretty fun. This is the old Courthouse Building, which no longer stands. As I said, that's where the state office building resides now, but also a very unique building. Almost looks a little bit more like a capitol than our current capitol, which is probably going to be its own video later on, because that's a very funny story as well. Also, something very unique about this album itself is that there are actually collages in here, and they're all printed on the same piece of paper. So these were specifically designed to group things together, which is very unique and not something that I've seen in a lot of these types of albums from that time period. And so this one has ships. You're going to see some of the Elks Building. A lot of these are important places in town, some of which are still standing. This was actually the seat of the first Alaskan legislature. So this building still exists in town. You can walk by it. Inside, got another collage. I'm just going to move quickly through these. These are different buildings around town, different images of miners, which Winter and Pond themselves actually had their own mining claims around Juneau, which they worked for about 10 years, though never really struck it rich. This is the old public school, which is now torn down, but sat next to where Juneau High School eventually did sit, which is now a legislative building. Juneau Fire Department. Both Winter and Pond were both members of the volunteer fire department, so very, very in touch with being Juneau citizens. They were also unique in photographers in that they actually lived in Alaska all year round versus other photographers that would come in the summer to photograph and then go home. Winter and Pond actually lived here all year round and photographed all year round. So they were actually incredibly influential members of Juneau society and were very involved in the various organizations here. This is the Greek church. It's actually a Russian Orthodox church, so it's interesting to see that nomenclature being used, but that church is still there, and you'll see an interview with the current priest, Father Simeon, as well as information about the memorial outside in one of our other videos. Other churches around town, other views of the area. This is going to be the St. Anne's Catholic Church area. Here's one where this photograph was actually added in later. It's a different paper, different style. Sorry. And this is another hospital, Simpson Hospital, that's no longer in existence, and something that I'm trying to research if that was related to the Belle Gould Simpson, who ran the Nugget Shop for a number of years here. You notice as it starts to get heavier on one side, I'm wanting to make sure that I continue to support everything so that way everything stays flat and safe. This is where actually the governor used to do his business. Just famous buildings around town. Actually, we know at least where two of these are. This is the Capitol Inn. So this is where our walking tours actually end even to this day, and it's still a functioning bed and breakfast. And then this house is actually 1 block up on 6th Street, 2 blocks up. And then we're going to finish with another panoramic. We actually have this one upstairs in our gallery, giant on the wall. This is an image of the Treadwell complex over on Douglas, and so you can see the different complexes from there. And there you have it. A lovely archival piece and an incredibly important reference and research tool because it's able to give us this completely different insight into what Juneau used to look like 100 years ago. Photographs are always helpful when you're talking about collections because so much of what we do is research and really trying to tell the stories of the past, and images so often are the most helpful way to do it. So this is just another great example of a wonderful thing in our collection. So thank you again for tuning in, and we'll see you guys soon. Thanks.